We just have one section of Ezekiel left to cover, but it's 9 chapters, 40 through 48. It is one complicated symbolic vision, and it is heartbreaking to the Jews. Okay. So we'll start in Ezekiel 40, verses 1 and 2. The 25th year of our captivity, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was captured, on the very same day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me there. In the visions of God, he took me into the land of Israel, and he set me on a very high mountain. On it, toward the south, was something like the structure of a city. All right. So, excuse me. The city was destroyed in 586. Okay. And so this is 14 years after that. So what is that, 572 or something like that? God doesn't take Ezekiel to Jerusalem because basically Jerusalem doesn't exist anymore. He says toward the south was something like the structure of a city. Okay. So again, God doesn't take him to Jerusalem because Jerusalem doesn't exist. But he does see something like a city, like the structure of a city. And this is very similar to the vision he saw back in chapter 8 when the Spirit of God departed. Okay. Excuse me. When I started out, I said this would be very distressing to the Jews. In my mind, we were back in chapter 8, and it's not what we're doing. So this is not that distressing, but it's still very critical and is very forward-looking. Okay. Verse 3, he says, chapter 40, verse 3, he says, he took me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze. He had a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand, and he stood in the gateway. verse 5. Now there was a wall around the outside of the temple. In the man's hand was a measuring rod 6 cubits long. So a cubit is about 18 inches. So this is about 9 feet. Okay. But then it's also a hand breadth. A hand breadth is that. So it's 4 inches. Okay. And he measured the width of the wall structure, 1 rod, and the height, 1 rod. Okay. So he's starting to measure the temple. He'll measure the city. He'll measure the temple. Verse 20, he says he measured it on the 4 sides. It had a wall all around, 500 cubits long and 500 wide. So it was a square. Okay. 500 cubits is roughly 750 feet. Okay. Now, since the rod the guy had had a hand's breadth added to it, that may make that measurement awful because it's not real clear in here to me when it's talking about that, if he's talking about he's using the rod with the extra 4 inches on it. But anyway, and it was to separate the holy areas from the common. So think back to the temple. In the innermost part of it, you had the Holy of Holies. That's where the ark sat. That's where the Spirit of God dwelt. Outside of that, you had the holy place. Okay. And then outside of that, you got into the more common areas. Okay. Where Jewish men could go. And then you had the place where Jewish women could go. Then you had what they call the court of the Gentiles. So that's kind of the overall makeup of the temple. He then measures and he lays out the city and the temple. Okay. So when he's talking about 500 cubits, it doesn't appear from the text that he's talking about an actual cubit. It appears he's talking about that rod. That's why I said it might mess it up a little bit with that extra 4 inches on the end of it. But 500 rods is roughly 5,600 feet, 56,000 feet. Okay, that's almost a mile. Well, this is a temple he's talking about, not the city. It's the city itself is like a mile square. I mean, the temple is like a mile square, not quite, but close to it. If we skip over to chapter 43, verses 1 and 2, he says, afterwards he brought me to the gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east. His voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone from his glory. Now, if you think back to chapter 8, when Ezekiel describes the glory of God leaving, which way did the Spirit leave? Do you remember? It went east toward the Mount of Olives, by the way. Okay. That gate on the eastern gate is also referred to as the Gate of Kings. So now we see the Spirit of God returning from the east, from the Mount of Olives, basically. Okay. And it's like in, let's see, 43 verses 3 through 5, it says, it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when I came to destroy the city. So again, he's making reference back to chapter 8. The visions were like the visions I saw by the river Shabar. And I fell on my face, and the glory of the Lord came into the temple by the way of the gate which faces toward the east. Again, the king, that's the king's gate. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So God has returned to dwell among his people. This is a symbolic vision he has of God's people returning to him, God returning to his people, and his people worshiping him. Now, we are not, that is 9 chapters, and we just covered it in about 10 minutes. So I'm not going to go into the detail. Remember, this is a survey class. But it's very interesting to go through and read and see what else Ezekiel had to say. But that really wraps up Ezekiel for us. Okay. Now, we're going to jump into Daniel. Now, several of you were in here when we went through months of studying Daniel. The ladies have just finished this week their study of Daniel. So I'm going to have Liz come up, and Liz told me I was not allowed to do that. Okay. So let's slide into Daniel. If you remember, when we first kind of did the intro months ago to this string of classes, I gave you how the Jews had the Bible divided, and one of the differences between how we view the Old Testament and how they view the Old Testament is the book of Daniel. They don't consider Daniel to be a prophet. He is lumped in with the history books. Okay. So we're going to talk about that, why that is a little bit. Now, so far, we have looked at 2 prophets of the Babylonian exile or the Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Jeremiah was back in Israel, back in Judah, in Jerusalem, for most of the time that he wrote that book. Ezekiel has been in Babylon the entire time. Okay. Jeremiah started before the Babylonian captivity, but his work went all the way through the 3rd captivity. Ezekiel started with the 2nd captivity, and we know, because we just read in Ezekiel about the temple falling. That was the 3rd captivity, the third time where they gathered people and took them to Babylon. So we know he prophesies past that. We really don't know when he stopped. Okay, but those 2 had very long ministries. Daniel had a really long ministry. Okay. Daniel 1 says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, this is Daniel 1:1, of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Now, what we normally see here in a book of prophecy is in the third year of Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Daniel, right? Or the hand of God was on Daniel. That's not what Daniel says here, right? Daniel says, in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Okay, so he's not given any kind of call right here. He's just giving you history. All right. Jehoiakim had been king for 3 years when Babylon came against Judah and Jerusalem. Okay. So did Daniel's ministry start there? Because that's normally what we see in a prophet is he starts out with when his ministry starts. No, his ministry didn't start there. It really didn't start for several years. Okay. And if you stop and ask yourself, how long did Daniel's ministry last? Anybody know how long the ministry lasted? How long he worked and prophesied? And if you look down in chapter 1, verse 21, it says, "Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus." Some translations say, "Thus Daniel was until the first year of King Cyrus." Okay. Well, from the time we know this from Jeremiah, basically, but from the time of the first exile until the time of the return of the Jews, which was the first year of King Cyrus, was 70 years. Okay. Now, Daniel was not born in the third year of King Jehoiakim. He was already probably an early teenager. We don't know, but based upon what instructions were given to the army, we would suspect he was probably early teenage. Okay. Jeremiah tells us that captivity was for 70 years. Now, Ezekiel's background was what? What was Ezekiel before God made him a prophet? He was a priest. Okay. We're not 100% sure what Jeremiah was. He probably was a priest or maybe a Levite. Levite, not 100% sure about that. Daniel's background was probably royalty. He was probably part of the royal family. If you look at verses 2 through 4, it says, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand being Nebuchadnezzar, with some of the artifacts of the house of God, and he carried into the land of Shinar, which is another word for Babylon, to the house of his God, and he brought the articles to the treasury house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good looking." That doesn't mean good looking the way we use the term. It basically means they were fit. They had a good physique type of thing. "Gifted in wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, with whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans." Okay. So there was a bunch of people taken in this first captivity. 4 of them are named. Daniel obviously was one of them. Who were the other 3? Actually, they were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are their Hebrew names. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But in chapter 1, they are listed by their Hebrew names. That's the only time, by the way, they're listed by their Hebrew names. Daniel, on the other hand, was given a Babylonian name, maybe because Daniel wrote the book, but he always referred to himself as Daniel. Okay. So Ezekiel and Daniel prophesying and working inside Babylon at the same time. Okay. So why did God have two prophets working in the same area at the same time? What were the differences between Daniel and Ezekiel? What did Ezekiel do for a living? He was a prophet. God called him to be a prophet. That's what he did. Was Daniel called to be a prophet? I'm not saying that he prophesied, but Daniel was a politician. He was, and I know that has a negative connotation in our society. Let's say he was a statesman. Okay. He was an executive in the government. Okay. Ezekiel was a priest and a prophet. Daniel was a statesman or a politician. Where was Ezekiel? Yeah, he was in Babylon, but where in Babylon was he? He was with the captives by the river Chebar. Was Daniel by the river Chebar? Daniel probably never went near the river Chebar. He was in Babylon, and those two places are not that close together. I think I got a map here with both of them. Okay, this area around Nippur is where the Jews were settled. That's down here, Siddur around here. Babylon's up over here. So again, it's not a huge difference, but they're really not right next to each other. So again, Daniel was not like a full-time prophet. Remember Amos, when God called Amos to be a prophet and go into Israel, he was in Judah, Tekoa, and God sent him into Israel to prophesy, and people in Israel went, "Get out of here with your prophecy." And his response was, "I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. I'm a sheep tender," right? And a sycamore pincher. So that I would tell people I did that for a living, but anyway. But he got called into prophecy, and he went and prophesied, and he went back to Cove, right? Daniel was always doing something else. Yes, he was interpreting dreams. Yes, he had dreams, but he was always doing something else. It was kind of like he was a part-time prophet, if you look at it that way. That's really one of the reasons the Jews don't include Daniel in their grouping of prophets. The other reason has to do with chapter 9, which we'll talk about down the road a little bit. They don't like chapter 9. Okay. So let's talk about the theme of Daniel. So again, we're going to kind of bounce around a little bit on this one. Daniel 1:1 says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." In verse 5, after they've described the captives being who the captives were, verse 5, he says, "And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, that at the end of that time they might serve before the king." I don't know if you stopped and thought about that, but you remember who's in charge of this group? What was his title? He was the captain of the eunuchs. Did I say anything about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Okay. Well, there's never any mention of family with these guys. Verse 19, still in chapter 1. "Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel." Now, I said they weren't mentioned again by name, but they are here. "Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king." So these 4 Jewish boys, who now are probably late teen, no more than 20, okay, are now serving before the king. Doesn't say here what they're doing, right? But they are serving the king. Chapter 2, verse 39. "But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth." Chapter 3, verse 2. "King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together all the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the prophet to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Who's not mentioned there? There's no mention of any kind of religious leader. Obviously, there's no Jews invited, right? But the Babylonians had religion, right? But there's nothing there about any of the religious people we invited. This is all government people. Chapter 4, verses 28 through 30. And all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built for my royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" We know that didn't end well for him. Chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Again, this is all government stuff. It's not religious stuff. It's all government stuff. Chapter 7, verses 17 and 18. Those great beasts, which are 4 kings, which shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom, and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Okay. Now, I know he's talking there about the saints of the Most High. The Jews were never referred to as saints, right? So there's no mention. We're 7 chapters in, basically, and this is nothing but government stuff. There's no real mention about the Jews. There's no mention of their sin. There's no mention about God's judgment being on them. None of that's in here. So this book of Daniel is extremely different from all the other prophets that we have looked at and will look at. So what do these verses talk about? They talk about kingdoms. They talk about governments. Now, what kind of governments are they talking about? And there's a lot of answers to this one. I'm looking for one particular word here. What kind of governments? Gentile governments. Okay. So Daniel is a Babylonian prophet. He is a prophet in Babylon. His ministry covers the entire Babylonian captivity, the whole 70 years. Again, he's not prophesying at the beginning because he's going through this training, right? But his story picks up day 1 of the captivity, and it goes through Cyrus's return, or allowing the Jews to return, Ezra and Nehemiah being sent back. Okay. After the Babylonian captivity, God's people, the Jews, were completely different. I've mentioned a couple of these things as we've gone through some of the other prophets. In some ways, better. In some ways, not so better. Number one, on the better side, this broke them of their idol worship. There's nothing in the Jewish history from the time they came back from Babylon that indicates they had anything to do with idol worship. There was no Baal, there's no Asherah, there's none of that. Okay, so it broke them of that. On the not so good side, Ezra and Nehemiah go back and they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They rebuild the temple, and some of the Jews go back, not all of them. Actually, if I understood it right, a small percentage of them actually went back. The rest of them had taken Jeremiah's advice and made themselves at home there in Babylon by Shelar. Okay. But who or what, however you want to look at it, did not return? The temple's there, the Jews are there. There's no mention of the presence of God being there. Okay. Now, what kind of government did the Jews, let me say the Hebrews, what kind of government did the Hebrews have before the Babylonian captivity? What is that referred to as? The king was physically here on earth, but who did the king answer to? God. I'm reading through Samuel and First, Second Samuel and Chronicles and all that, and Every time David went to do something except marry somebody, every other thing he went to do, he'd ask God, should I go up against the Philistines? Shall I do this? Shall I do that? God was telling him what to do every step of the way, which is why David was so successful, at least earlier in his life, again, before all the wives and the children kind of got away a little bit, right? Afterwards, what kind of government, after they came back, what kind of government did they have? It wasn't a theocracy anymore. It was maybe it was a kingdom, but it was a Gentile kingdom. They were still ruled by Persia, and then they were ruled by Greece, and then they were ruled by Rome. Okay. Today, they're back in the land with a Jew at the head, but it's still not really a theocracy. It's just a government. Okay. Prior to the return, anytime God was talking about the Gentile nations, he was talking about them as being the rod of his anger. He was going to use Syria to punish Israel. He was going to use Assyria to punish Israel and Judah to a degree. He was going to use Babylon to punish Judah. They were the rod of his anger. After that, they were just the rulers of God's people. They just ran the show. Yeah. Persia, Greece, Rome, Britain. Up until 48, between World War One and in World War One in 1948, Britain ruled the Middle East. They were the ones in charge of it by mandate. Yeah. So this time period that really started with the Babylonian captivity, you might want to put it at the return at that as a point. But that time from there till today and going forward a little bit more till Jesus comes back is referred to a couple of ways. It's referred to as the rule of the Gentiles, and in some places in the Bible, it's referred to as the time of the Gentiles. In the New Testament, they tend to say the time of the Gentiles. Paul says until the time of the Gentiles is completed. Okay. Daniel is the only one of the prophets that address this period in a political way. Jeremiah doesn't do. Jeremiah gives the king political advice, but it's political advice he's getting that God's telling him to tell the king. Don't go to Egypt. Don't rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. Ezekiel is prophesying and seeing visions, but again, not in a political way. Those are spiritual. He sees the glory of God leave. He sees the glory of God come back. Right. Daniel is really just politics. Even his visions going forward, right? He interprets the dream. He talks about the four kingdoms. He sees the four beasts, the four kingdoms, right? Even his prophecy about the end time is basically a political thing. The Antichrist is going to set up a political government to rule the world. Now he's going to try to turn it into a spiritual thing where you worship him, right? But it is basically a political scenario. In chapter 9 of Daniel, which is, I mentioned earlier, it's one of the reasons the Jews really don't like to look at Daniel. If we talked about that in here when we went through Daniel, the ladies talked about it because I was in here for part of that conversation. If you interpret chapter 9, we'll look at this in some more detail when we get to it. If you interpret chapter 9, the weeks that Daniel describes, and understand those are weeks of years, not just weeks, from basically the start of what Daniel was talking about until the time he predicts the Messiah comes is the same number of years before Jesus came. So if you interpret that chapter of Daniel, it's very clear that the Messiah has already come. And the Jews, even when they read Daniel, they don't read chapter 9. They'll skip it. Okay. Because it's really pretty clear. As long as you do it's a week of years, not a week of, not a week of days kind of a thing, then all the timing falls exactly with Christ. Okay. We're in the gap between the end of Daniel's prophecy and then the extra week that he has on the end, which is the tribulation period. But there's a gap defined in there, and that's the period of time we're living in right now. All right. So that's the introduction to Daniel. The theme of Daniel is basically politics. Okay. There's a lot of prophecy of the future, but it's all wrapped around politics. It's all wrapped around governments, kingdoms, countries. When you say kingdom, in our world, you can think nation or country, right? Back then, the head of a country was the king, and it was a kingdom. Today, it's a country or a nation, right? Because not many places have kings anymore. Jordan has one, but England has one, right? But honestly, in England, that king is more of a figurehead. The king in Jordan is really more powerful, but he's not like he can't do anything he wants to do. He's not the authoritative ruler. He has to work with the rest of the government to get things done. Any questions about what we covered today?
Will that then be considered major or minor prophet? Somewhere in between.
He's a minor prophet.